My name is Sarah Bannerman. Welcome to the Communication and Cultural Policy Conference in the Age of the Platform. We're here now for the session Platform Governance, Media Policy or Telecommunications Regulation as a Guide, which is organized by Professor Dwayne Winsek at Carleton University.
Although I will introduce Dana. So Dana's coming to us here from the University of Calgary. Welcome, Dana. We haven't met before, but it's very nice to meet you, and looking forward, hopefully, to hearing your presentation today. The internets. I love the pluralization. We've got more than one internet. And so the internet's the changing relevance of internet protocols in next generation broadband networks. So while I've still got a connection, I'll turn it over to you, Dana, and I hope I'm here at the end of your presentation and all the way through. Take care.
Thank you. I'll just quickly get started. Hello, my name is Dana Kramer, and I am a soon-to-be completed and outgoing MA student at the University of Calgary and incoming PhD student at Ryerson University this fall. Today, I will be talking about a growing development in international internet standardization, being the fragmentation of transport layer internet protocols, and how this has spurred from evolving broadband networks and the Internet of Things. To start, I would like to recognize I am presenting from Calgary, Alberta, which is Treaty 7 land and the traditional territories of the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprising the Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation and the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nations. Calgary is also home to Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. Historically, the internet's transport layer has been dubbed as dumb pipes with smart edges, and that the power of the internet rested in these edges, with the core being passive. The internet as we know it today is built on one standard being TCP over IP, developed by Vint Cerf and Bob Kahn in their work on the ARPANET project. TCP over IP as a transport protocol suite has prevailed in decades of discourse surrounding the evolution of the transport layer of the internet's infrastructure. That, however, was challenged on the 18th of July, 2018 in Geneva, Switzerland, when Dr. Richard Lee, chief scientist of FutureWay, Huawei Technologies' US-based research division, gave a 21-slide presentation at the third annual ITU IMT 2025G workshop and demo day. This demonstration day was part of an International Telecommunication Union, or ITU, conference for determining working study groups across the ITU-T, which is a standardization sector of the ITU for the study of evolving 5G technologies. Throughout the presentation, Lee emphasized that the current TCP over IP protocol suite could not keep up with the trajectories of internet usage, which had progressed from text, image, voice, video, virtual reality, and on the horizon, holograms. He argued that TCP over IP as a protocol suite could not transfer the bits of data fast enough for evolving networks past 5G with a reduction in latency. As he stated in this 2018 presentation, if we design a network to support 5G, we'd better design it for a lifespan going over 5G. In this slide, where he first makes this argument, we see these parallel roads, one with roadblocks and augmented without, creating an imagery of growth through focus on future broadband networks and next generations of wireless. In this slide and throughout his presentation to the ITU, as 5G comes and passes, there will be vast changes in the data consumption due to changing uses of the internet. These changes would require terabyte per second data transfers opposed to 5G-enabled gigabyte per second transfers along the TCP over IP transport layer. The projected uses for the terabyte per second transfers would first and foremost be for new adoptions of holograms. Lee emphasizes this with a slide half devoted to a scene from the first Star Wars movie where Luke Skywalker has turned on the hologram of Princess Leia asking old Ben Kenobi for help. To conclude his presentation, Lee has a call to action for the ITU in big blue bolded font. We are proposing a new focus group on Network 2030 in SG13. We welcome and invite you all to join us and help shape a new internet. SG13 is a designation to represent ITU-T Study Group 13, Future Networks with focus on IMT 2020, cloud computing, and trusted infrastructure. The objectives of the study group are to focus next generation networks, or NGNs, with a special focus on future networks and mobile telecommunications. Their role is to study NGNs and make standardization policy recommendations, which are more energy efficient, support new industries like intelligent transport systems, and overall standardizing enhancements for new introductions of ICTs, which rely on these NGNs. Where NGNs continue to be the primary focus of SG13, this is beginning to change. Now, SG-13 has also been mandated with the task of future networks, or FNs, which are defined as networks past NGNs, which will be the 5G and beyond era. The mandate of SG-13 is vast. They are expected to aid in standardization research on international scale for analog to digital transitions, aid in NGN to FN transitions, provide research and recommendation on standards to help energy consumption along these NGNs and FNs in cloud computing, infrastructure, and X as a service. They are also asked to continuously research IoT technologies and standards to support them, and are required to do all of this with a framework mission of environmental and socioeconomic awareness. Overall, SG-13 is given an incredibly large mandate in an increasingly relevant area of the global economy being internet infrastructure. For Canada, representation in SG-13 and more broadly the ITU-T, Ericsson Canada is our main representative. This is part of ISED's national study groups, or the NSGs, to mirror each of the ITU-T's study groups. These NSGs are part of what are called the Canadian National Organization for the ITU-T, or CNO over ITU-T. The CNO over ITU-T was established in 1973 with a set objective to promote and coordinate Canadian participation in the activities of the ITU-T. In the longer thesis that I write, I do have quite a bit of criticism of ISED's model for CNO over ITU-T, specifically as it relates to excluding the CRTC from this group. All of these industry partners and also academic partners with Concordia, for example, they're not compensated for their labor, which has resulted in Canadian public knowledge of what is occurring at the ITU-T, specifically in SG-13, as being quite limited. From Richard Lee's 2018 presentation, a focus group was in fact enacted in SG-13. It has proposed the following dramatic change to the internet we know today. Networks overall, not only at the edge, but become increasingly richer in terms of technology, ownership, and end user participation. Quite likely, there will not just be one, but many public internets. New technologies further widen the constraints for transmitting packets through the utilization of infrastructure-based wireless mesh, satellite fixed line technologies, such as fiber optics, all of which must be accompanied by the fundamental packet transfer solution while adhering to the underlying ownership relations when traversing those different networks. As a consequence, the end-to-end realization of services across those many internet environments needs strong services consideration for Network 2030, and is an increasing departure from the structures of networks as we see today. In other words, which ICANN and Cisco have also noted, we are about to see an end to the end-to-end principle. This point of many public internets, the focus group, which was chaired by Richard Lee, is described in this white paper and a subsequent aggressive public relations campaign by Huawei as ManyNets. It is important to note, however, ManyNets is a PR campaign opposed to a key term, whereas internets is more appropriate, as this has always occurred specifically in the largest transport layer developer, being NASA, since 1997. The aggressive marketing campaign to think of ManyNets as a logical progression in internet infrastructure has been most apparent as Huawei have attacked two female UK-based journalists. This occurred first in a blog post by Huawei, where they specifically tag an article by the Financial Times in the UK, which is the only news source of these emerging internets to come. This news report was analyzing how Huawei and other Chinese companies and innovation departments in the Chinese government have submitted a standardization request for what they call New Internet Protocol, or New IP, which is the new and next internet the SG-13 focus group had specified as needing for future broadband networks and wireless technologies. A second area where this theme of attacking journalist credibility came to fruition at a talk by the Internet Society this past September. In this talk, Lee pictured above in his panel with Internet Society CEO Andrew Sullivan and Milton Mueller as moderator. As he states about 20 minutes into the talk, when him and Mueller are discussing media coverage of new IP, he states, firstly, I would say, don't trust media. Media's a lot of disinformation and misinformation there. And it is quite misleading. So unfortunate people even make a decision and influence from the media. It should be noted that the journalistic coverage of new IP is correct. had contacted Lee prior to publication for comments, which he refused, and consulted with various internet experts, such as Shoshana Zuboff, author of The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, representatives to NATO, and historic European internet engineers. Cisco and ICANN have also come out in high refusal of this new set of protocols, which will fragment the internet into varying internets within the 2030 to 2035 timeline. This fragmentation comes down to where you start on these two questions. Do we want this? How do we do it? Currently, there are technologies which have been expressed as being wanted. However, the TCP over IP suite of ordinances will not support them, holograms being the most prevalent. This knowledge of replacement of TCP over IP is not new. It's always been lingering, and as Britt Paris's PhD dissertation defended in 2018, with its first article stemming from that work published at the start of this year, the US has had its NSF funding 3 contenders over the past decade for this new internet's reality. Her research has also identified that engineers have been using intricate ways to get around the TCP over IP limitations using the HTTP protocol as a failover. My research builds on this conversation of internet fragmentation and future internet, showing that this is not just Huawei or Chinese government campaign, but instead one which was set to happen. In their research, Wei Roch, who is a PhD candidate in Germany, and Winzen published this past February a study conducted showing the 3 waves of internet protocol standardization, first occurring with the academic DARPA-funded institutions. Second release we see of the internet with US-based technology corporations in the standardization of RFCs. But since 2018, also when Richard Lee called for the focus group with ITUT's SG13, we see Huawei with the IETF as the largest RFC submitter, thereby shaping internet standards. Again, my work builds on these findings of Huawei becoming a large internet standardization player globally. As recently as less than a month ago, the US Senate has now proposed a bipartisan bill to counter emerging Chinese internet standardization dominance. In its Section 209B1, the bill states the United States and its allies and partners should maintain participation and leadership at international standard settings bodies for 5th and future generation mobile telecommunication systems and infrastructure. The bill has gone through 2 readings in the US Senate Foreign Relations Committee as of the 15th of April, 2021, and it's too early to see how this bill will affect Canada as an ally to the US in international telecommunication bodies. What my thesis more generally shows in its entirety is that transport layer internet protocols are not just passive dumb pipes, but instead highly political in their inception, and since 2018 are being heavily challenged in international internet standardization arenas, as well that the TCP over IP suite is not a future-proof technology and is about to hit its end, along with the end to the end-to-end principle. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Dana. Here I am. I'm now flipping back and forth between 2 screens. Enough about me. Dana, that was really lovely. It's very hard to get into the inside of Chinese attempts to shape internet technology and policy within the country and internationally. So hats off to you for a really excellent paper and well delivered. So I'm going to turn it over now to Lian Ray, and I am just going to turn it over to you, Lian Ray, and you can introduce your topic because I can't navigate 2 screens anymore.
Okay, so can you see my screen okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. So hello everyone, and thank you so much for having me, and thanks for being here. So my talk is going to be about how Apple App Store is governed in China. And I feel like this is such a nice way flowing from David's presentation to Dana's, the kind of as a case study of how to tie all of these topics all together. So a bit of introduction. When we're talking about app stores, they are regarded as very powerful and also as a form of infrastructural platform services. So they are crucial for both the economics development and growth of the platform. So as we see, it's manifested with the introduction of iPhone and the whole control of iOS and its developer ecosystem. And also several other scholarly studies have looked at how Apple App Store as a gatekeeper of freedom of expression. So the studies are largely situated in a Western context and looking at how app stores have taken down apps in some circumstances. And in the 2018 piece, Carlton Gillespie has further looked at the governance by app stores and argued that they are very important in terms of controlling the quality and editorial process of the app publications. And they're essentially serving as a clearinghouse as well as a marketplace. And also, I think, as David just illustrated, serving the controller of the tools, the API, the SDKs for the app developers. So a lot of this literature, as I'm kind of expanding on such projects in my postdoc research, I find that a lot of the studies are positioning the platform companies as the corporate, right? So they're the evil, or they are the powerful in terms of controlling seemingly like very powerful forces, and they are also the foci of critique. And when I started to examine how the situation is unfolding in the Chinese ecosystem, I find that the power of platforms, or in particular app stores, are a bit more complicated, as these are nested in the political and economic conditions of the Chinese internet governance. So first, as a bit of the background, so the Chinese internet, of course, although it developed fairly late, it is the 71st century country that entered or has a stable global internet connection. But by far, it has received a very kind of rapid growth in terms of its mobile population. So even though that the internet connection or penetration rate is only slightly over 60%, but among all of the internet users in China, almost all of them, so this translates to 932 million out of the 940 million access the internet through mobile phones. So we have a very large growing mobile internet population. And therefore, this means that China is also one of the largest in terms of app market. And in fact, the spending or the whole scale of the industry has surpassed the United States back in 2016. And it is also one of the free markets that are free from the Apple and Alphabet duopoly. So this is also kind of originated or formulated as a historical development, because Google has withdrawn its search engines from China back in 2010. And this also means that the Google Play Store is not readily available on a lot of the domestically manufactured mobile devices, and therefore really gives the space for third-party Android developers to flourish. So in terms of the market structure, we have a very chaotic and also booming third-party Android stores. And as you can see that different players, so ranging from the big platform companies such as Tencent to mobile device manufacturer like Huawei and Oppo, they are dominating the third-party Android stores. And all of these stores are not certified as the official Android, so which means that they are not preloaded with the Google suite of apps. And Tencent so far is the largest in terms of App Store market share, so it has 26%, followed by Huawei and Oppo. And if we're talking about the revenue shares, so in the Apple or Google Play stores, the revenue share is usually 30% versus 70%. But in China, the 50-50 is the industry norm. And when I was researching about this revenue share structure, is always very, it's not explicitly written as in the Western context. And usually if you are a big game developer, you will have a lot of negotiating power with the app stores regarding distribution, revenue share, and basically the whole app store industry or economy is very different from the West. And more specifically, by focusing on Apple in China, we can look at that China has contributed roughly 20% of Apple's net sales. And compared to the US, which is 40%, so China is fairly a very large global market for Apple. And when we're talking about the revenue from iTunes software, and also this category also include App Store revenue. So this stream has becoming increasingly important for Apple. So by 2020, in the annual report, this generates roughly 20% for Apple. And if we compare the Apple user versus the Android users, because given the kind of the cultural and economic status that's signified by Apple, and yearly iPhone users or iPad users spend much more on apps compared to Android. And I think this is also reinforcing the current statistics on the spending patterns on Android versus Apple. So people tend to spend more on iOS. And for all of the Apple devices, given the regulation that instituted by the Chinese government, all of the ad call data are hosted in mainland. So this is one of the data localization effort that instituted by the Chinese government through the cybersecurity law back in 2017, which means that any of the foreign internet service or content providers have to partner with a local data collection and hosting agencies. So the data is relatively kind of localized in the mainland China. And once we look at the App Store economy and Apple's role in China, so there is the kind of unavoidable kind of background if we're looking at any issues that dealing with internet governance in China, and that is the overarching themes of China's cyber sovereignty and also the increasingly heavy-handed regulation that are imposed on the service providers. So the role of cyber sovereignty, I think, is arguably getting more attention and importance. So it has this policy origin back in 2010 in a white paper called The Internet in China. And also interestingly, this document was outcome of the Google's withdrawal from the Chinese internet back in 2010, where the tension between US freedom of flow of information, freedom of express, versus the Chinese version of the sovereignty and a regulation of internet really heightened. So in this paper, you can see that the state has really prioritized the public responsibility or the kind of the state's security over the individual rights to the internet, and also claimed that the Chinese government plays a leading role in internet administration. And such principle was later reiterated in 2012 and 2013 as Xi Jinping came to power. So previously, the internet governance was really dispersed in multiple bureaucracies and has its problems of making the enforcement really hard, really a difficult task. But as Xi come into power, there comes a wave of centralization of power. So in terms of the institutional setup, we have the Cyberspace Administration of China that is formally established in 2014. And this is a very top level kind of regulation that oversees the whole running and administration of the internet in China. And this organization is led by Xi himself and also Li Keqiang, the premier. So you can see this is the new kind of policy-making body, and you can see that it's getting increasingly important in instituting policies to regulate the Chinese internet. And also another important venue for it to showcase and tout its vision of cyber sovereignty is the World Internet Conference. So the Chinese version of NetMondel, or its own version of how internet should be governed collectively on the international arena. So the conference was fairly kind of high level back in 2014, but recently it has shrunk in scale. So previously, Apple's CEO has attended this conference, but in 2020 and 2021 with the COVID, the conference has not been put in place. And in terms of the legal principles, the rule of cyber sovereignty, which basically claims that the cyberspace should be governed as a kind of a realm of such as land, water, or air. So the legal principle was also further enshrined in the cybersecurity law that come into play in 2017. So under this framework, so my study delved into the regulation or the interplay between states and Apple App Store in China. And there are three processes or three vantage points that the power of the platform is contested. So first, it's through the app review process and app takedown process. And lastly, it's about an episode between the country's leading internet platforms, WeChat, which is owned by Tencent, and its contestation over Apple's revenue share rule. So let's take a look at each. So in terms of the app review, as the authorities are governing the internet is becoming more centralized, and the government is really kind of playing catch up in terms of the regulation since 2014. So there are basically a lot of new regulations that kind of keep all these different apps and internet services in check. So the Apple become the enforcer, the de facto enforcer of this government licensing rule. So one of the category of apps that are game apps become heavily regulated since 2016. So what the Chinese government said is that the developer must obtain a game registration license, and that number has to be obtained by the state administration of press, publication, radio, film, and television. So this is a very kind of making the regulation really complicated and strange. So basically, if you wanted to publish a game, you have to partner with either a state-owned kind of media organization, the so-called more the traditional mainstream media, or you have to partner up with a press, basically. So there are textbook publisher basically publishing or holding the license number for the games. And in terms of the design of the game app, the state also said that you need to have an anti-addiction plan for the young players, and you have to build that features into the games. So this licensing rules come into play back in 2017, but there was a loophole that has not been, so which means that the Apple has not effectively enforcing this rule. But in 2020, that the state say it's tightening or kind of fasten the screws on the enforcement of this rule. Therefore, Apple has removed thousands of apps from the Chinese app stores. So
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Just gonna have to give you a heads up. At times you're already a little bit over time, so if you could wrap up within the next minute, that'd be great.
Great. Okay. So app licensing is one of the key. Kind of you can see that the power has been imposed by the state. And similarly on VPN and other internet content publishings. And app takedowns, of course, has implications for free speech and also constitutes a part of the internet censorship more widely on the Chinese internet. And lastly, this episode between Tencent and Apple. It's basically Tencent has this tipping function on its WeChat public account. And Apple saying we wanted to have a 30% cut of the spending in app. But Tencent restricted and also suspended its tipping function, which eventually lead Apple to change its rule on the revenue distribution on the item that's spent in the app. And this rule applies to globally. So I think this also can tell us about the power play that intersect between very powerful platforms, companies in a certain market versus the so-called global platform giants. So I'm happy to answer more or elaborate in the Q&A.
Okay, well, thank you very, very much, Lian-Rui. Always fascinating to listen to your presentations and to see you continuously follow the really difficult threads that need to be followed to get a good handle on what's going on in China. All right. Now it's my turn. I have got myself thoroughly flustered, bouncing back and forth between different modes of connectivity. I now have 3 screens in front of me, one to keep time, which is already blacked out. One, my big screen, so I can look at my PowerPoint, and then one, my laptop, so I can look at you. So really nice to see everybody, and thank you for coming. And Sarah, if you could just send around my PowerPoint again, I would really like that if people could have that. Instead of sharing a screen, I find it's really helpful to just let people have it at their side and they can follow along. So what I'm going to do is I'll be going through my slides, just hitting the high points. And a lot of the slides are going to have some visualizations that give you the kind of, let's say, they give you the evidence for claims that I make. And I'll just like skip over them with the understanding that you can go and look at them when you want, and we can talk about them later. So, but the whole raison d'etre of this this panel, I mean, 2 years in the, this has been 2 years in the making. And in that 2 years, I mean, it seems like that the idea of platform regulation has constantly been on a high boil. One can't get any sleep, really, if you're trying to follow this. And I mean, so extensive are these activities that Manuel Pupas and I, 2 years ago or a year and a half ago, said, somebody ought to keep track of everything that's going on so we can keep our heads straight. Well, Manuel and I took this on, and that list now is close to 100 items long. Right here in Canada, we've got C10 that's now on a high boil. This was teed up a year and a half ago by the BTLR report. We've got Consumer Privacy Protection Act, online harms legislation coming down the pipe, and a Senate bill on restricting young people's access to adult content. I was talking to people at Heritage. They've got 4 different working groups, one on C10, another on online harms, another that's trying to adapt the Australian News Code for Canada. And then they're resuscitating website blocking at the ISP level, which is, this kind of whack-a-mole game that gets played. I mean, it's clear that GAFM is under increased and intense criticism. Policy regimes created in the 1990s and 2000s are said to have enabled them to re-centralize, to platformize, as David might say, the internet, and to remake the internet essentially in their image. And here and around the world, Google and Facebook's dominance in particular of the ad-driven business model, as Eddie Greenspan and the others at PPF wrote a couple of years back, are a form of vampire economics, hence my reference sometimes to vampire squids, that they are primarily responsible for the crisis of journalism and for upending the media and cultural industries and for destroying democracy. We look at our field and we see that many communication and media scholars are saying that platforms are media companies. The debate over, and this should be C10, not C11, and free speech is premised on the belief that platforms are broadcasters. Since digital platforms are media companies, media policy should be our North Star when it comes to inventing a new generation of internet regulation. So that's the case against GAFM, if you would. Here's my case, and it's definitely not a case in support of GAFM, but rather to try to put things on a completely different footing, to reconceptualize the lines of analysis and critique. So my critique is, one, that the contemporary way of thinking about the platforms is historically inaccurate or misleading or shallow. That to call them media companies, and especially broadcasters, is sociologically and institutionally inaccurate and misleading. That to claim that they are the primary cause of the twin crisis of journalism and the media is empirically unsupportable by and large, although they have not been of any help to journalism, and their impact on the media industries writ large, I think, is more ambivalent. I think we should be thinking a lot more about telecoms regulation as a potential model that we can selectively pick from as a guide to a new generation of platform regulation, and that is far superior to broadcasting regulation. And then if we continue to go along this line of continually thinking about platforms as media companies and broadcasting regulation as a model, there are serious limits to our analysis and significant and undesirable consequences. So argument one, history matters. You know, I'm coming at this as a telecom scholar and from the Cultural Industry School of Political Economy of Communication. And basically what the Cultural Industry School says is that the modern media industry since the mid-19th century have developed in very close proximity to the vastly larger telecommunications, electrical equipment manufacturing, and banking industries. Okay, so I think that's where we need to start. The second, you know, here's a nice little image here. I'm on slide 8. Media history is tightly intertwined with big tech, and there's lessons for platform regulation. Sure, we might score some victories if we focus on platforms like broadcasters and content regulation, but we're really going to seriously damage our understanding of that long-standing historical relationship between the much larger telecom and IT sectors and the media and cultural industries. And we're going to be completely blinded to alternative approaches to platform regulation. Next slide. Here's an area that I think is absolutely fascinating. And every time I go back into it, my mind is just completely blown. You know, if we look in the 1920s and the 1930s and the development of the radio, broadcasting, and film industries within North America, who is the lead player in this? It's AT&T and something called the Radio and Electrical Group, consisting of massive electrical equipment manufacturers like GE, Westinghouse, RCA, and so on. And they're active not just in North America, but also in the UK and in Europe. In fact, in the UK, 6 of these electrical equipment manufacturers set up the original British Broadcasting Company, which is then nationalized 4 years later to become the British Broadcasting Corporation. We only see AT&T leave the industries, the broadcasting industry, as part of an agreement with these other players and under forceful regulatory kind of oversight and threats of intervention from the FCC at the end of the 1930s. In terms of, you know, our platforms, media companies, sure, they do a lot of content moderations. They absolutely are not mere content conduits or neutral platforms. They are involved in content aggregation and automated decision-making at scale and speed, and these are crucial. But this is not equivalent to what we know from 3 or 4 decades of the sociology of media, sociology of news, production, and it's not at all like commissioning, licensing, owning, publishing, scheduling, and creating a catalog of book, film, TV, music, and game titles, as the cultural industries would tell us. Yes, their spending on content has gone up in recent years, but as a fraction of their own activities, it is tiny, it's minuscule, it hardly shows up. It's around 1 to 5%, depending upon the company that you're looking at, versus 50 to 2/3 of all expenditures at, say, a Disney or a Viacom. It's just not core to who they are, what they do, their identity, their culture. And as the French regulator ARCEP noted, social networks do not select each item of content published on the service or carry out selection prior to the publication of content. I think it gets it right when it says platforms are information organization systems. I want to make sure that people understand that I don't object to calling Netflix, though, a media company. So claims that platforms are destroying journalism and the media, I think, are very wide of the mark. There definitely has been 4 sectors, all advertising based, that have seen their revenues decline since 2008. Why 2008? Well, 2008 was the year of the great financial crisis, when advertising spending across the economy fell off a cliff, okay? We see newspaper circulation levels, and nobody talks about this in the public policy forum or in Shattered Mirror, for example. It's been falling off a cliff since the 1950s on a household basis, the 1980s on a per capita basis, and since the 2000s in absolute terms. Basically, after advertising revenue fell off a cliff in 2008, what we see is a downward pressure. You see that advertising spending is shrinking or stagnating, and Google and Facebook are emerging and consolidating their dominance at precisely this period. So what we see is that traditional media companies are battling the global internet giants over a shrinking advertising pie,
hence all of the concern, okay? Blaming Google, I think also ignores a quarter of a century of self-inflicted wounds from excessive mergers and acquisitions, financialization, and unsustainable debts. And in Canada, grafting the media and cultural industries onto telephone companies that don't know a bloody thing about running media companies. And these media sectors or divisions within these companies are subordinated to the real engines of these companies, which is selling mobile wireless services and broadband internet access services. They could give a damn about media content services, and the media content services profit levels within these companies is half that of their pipes division. So their fiduciary obligation is to maximize profits. So where should they focus? Of course, they should focus on the pipes, and that's where they do, hence the neglect. And this is structural, and it is core to the Canadian media industries. A quick photo of, look at advertising spending as a percentage of GDP. I want to keep going on, all right? The key thing here is most media sectors are not supported by advertising. They're based on subscriptions and direct pay. The pay per media sectors outstrip advertising by a 5-to-1 ratio in Canada, 3-to-1 in the United States. They are the engines. They are growing fast. Here are some quick pictures to show this. Content media, next page. Looking at slide 16, looking at network media as a whole, we see massive, massive growth. Do Google and Facebook dominate? Absolutely. In some areas, online search, Google's dominance is absolutely clear, and it is buttressed by this massive vertical integration now. Here's an area where regulators could dive in and start to talk about things drawn from telecommunications regulation that go all the way back to the 1910s and 1920s. Breaking them up, structural separation between different layers in the internet stack, requiring Google to hive off its vertically integrated ad stack, as well as its control over audience data from its top level service offerings. We look at Facebook, massive growth here. There's no doubt about it. Between it and Google, they now dominate 80% of online advertising in Canada, and their consolidation is tightening over time, not lessening. We can see this in the next slide, page 19. The big two now account for 80% of all online advertising. For sure then, GAFM has carved out a big spot for themselves. Google and Facebook are now the 5th and 7th largest entities in the network media economy in Canada, respectively. Netflix accounts for over half of the online video services market. But think about this, the top 6 global internet companies' share of revenue in Canada is 10%. All right, it's big, it's growing very fast, but it's only 10% of a $90 billion media economy. The big 5 Canadian companies, in contrast, control 75%, 3/4 of that $90 billion economy. Bell alone has revenues that are nearly 3 times that of GAFM and Netflix in Canada. Okay, here is a visual representation on slide 22. Okay, to just show the size of each of these companies. Argument 4, we need to go back to telecoms regulation. Why? It takes it back further in time. It takes us back to the middle 19th century when we see the consolidation of industrial capitalism, the rise of regulated capitalism, the rise of the industrial media, and the relationship between the media industries, telecoms, and the IT industries. It's also the moment when communication studies as a field begins to kind of emerge out of sociology and an economic history and economic sociology. So our intellectual origins of the field rest in this area and they are struggling to come to terms with that, with these new formations, industrial media, the cultural industries, all right, and their relationships to these other sectors of power in society, not just political power, but industrial power. Telecoms regulation also offers us bright line ex ante rules. That is, the rules of the game are set into place beforehand. Okay, Sarah, can you give me 1 or 2 more minutes or no?
Sure. Yep.
Okay.
But you are over time.
Okay, I will wrap it up real quickly. Okay, Media policy doesn't have a monopoly on normative values. Telecoms policy highlights control over economic power, social inclusion and participation through universal and affordable service, freedom of expression via control over gatekeepers, via common carriage, net neutrality, strong data and privacy protection. Okay, next slide. There are 4 major kind of principles or cornerstones of telecoms regulation: structural separation, firewalls, public obligations, public alternatives, that I think would be a really good place to start. Going quickly now, this is the next 3 slides are just a list of countries and some of their structurally oriented inquiries that you might want to look at. Going to the very last, second last slide, and I won't go through all this, but here's my laundry list of what goes wrong if we start to build our pivot for understanding how we should be developing a new generation of internet or platform regulation. Our history is shallower and it should be deeper. We turn a blind eye to other sources of media power and concentration and consolidation. I mean, the amount of ink spilt on the platforms and regulation, and the fact that nobody is focusing in on the Rogers and Shaw merger, the 6th largest merger in Canadian history, drives me absolutely bananas. Okay, the idea that, you know, all the focus is on content regulation versus structural regulation also drives me bananas as well. That we are now in the process of universalizing the exceptional and restrictive standards of broadcasting regulation set in the early to mid 20th century and applying it to all forms of mediated communication, I think is regressive in this extreme. No other media is subject to as strict and restrictive and low standards of expressive rights protection than broadcasting. And this is what we are now set to universalize. Okay, I think this is a real mistake. Okay, and last, whenever we look at the Australian, you know, digital platform inquiry, the Butler inquiry, the CRTC, they wander off into all sorts of areas about, you know, trusted and verifiable news sources, disinformation, misinformation, and they lay the responsibility almost exclusively for this lawful but awful speech at the feet of the platforms. Last point, the assumptions underpinning a lot of this discourse are based upon omnipotent media effects assumptions, which have been completely discredited by over a half a century of research. We need to go back to the drawing board. Thank you for indulging me and going overboard and over time. Okay, well, thank you. So now we have some questions, and you know, I'm here to take questions, but we can also, you know, Sarah, if you can give me a hand, because I really have got myself kind of, you know, out of whack by looking at these multiple screens and the extent to which I had to scramble to get caught up. It was pretty disconcerting. So, but I'll do my best. But
sure. Well, why don't we invite participants in the session to, well, anyone on the session, on the call, to put any comments or questions in the chat, and we can call on them from there. While we're waiting for that, are there any questions for some of the presenters for each other or comments? And if not, then I guess, okay, we've got one question in, okay, they're coming into the chat now. The first question, there's 2 questions here for Professor Wincek. How would telecom policy address new issues of AI, data, and manipulative apps? And another question in for Professor Wincek. How do you justify using the concepts of telecom regulation for GAFAM when it obviously didn't work in Canada and led us to become one of the most concentrated countries in terms of media with the vertical integration in Canada?
Yeah, so I'll take both of those questions in order. So David, I think one of the really important things that we see out of telecoms regulation is the idea that it has always been focused on opening up the black box by looking at the terms and conditions of device interfaces, network interoperability and interconnection, and technology standards. I think that's a really important lever that we can now adapt and apply in this domain. And I think we've also had the possibility of strong privacy and data protection. I mean, the flip side of common carriage is to ensure the kind of the sanctity of the privacy of people's correspondence. Okay, so I think we get that right there. And the the manipulative apps, again, opening up the design. This is fundamental, and that was fundamental to why AT&T was pushed out of the movie industry, pushed out of the radio industry, and restrictions put into place, firewalls put into place in Canada that kept until the mid 1990s Bell and the telcos out of the content industries. And that goes to Catalina's question. Basically, I say we rewind and undo the mistakes that were made from the rah-rah years of the 1990s that were, the exact same years that led us to the dot-com bubble and collapse. And we realized that that was a fool's errand. We made a mistake, and we left a lot of good tools unused and on the table. And I think when you look even at more recent CRTC chairs, like von Finkenstein, he hugely regrets, and basically if you sit down with him, he offers a mea culpa for basically buggering everything up by believing that vertical integration and consolidation would be essential to allowing Canadian firms to bulk up and effectively compete in a new era of globalization. So the regulators themselves admit their mistakes. We see that coming out of the Competition Bureau. And for the last 12 years, we've seen successive liberal and conservative governments. And here, we're talking mainstream politics, not even on the kind of more progressive and radical edges, basically trying to unwind mistakes. But what have we got? We've got these powerful companies that are pushing on every single lever to protect their interests. And of course, when they've got 40% profits on, $70 billion, they have a ton of power to basically hold back the tide.
I'm just going to suggest that we extend the session by about 5 minutes, since we did start a little bit late, to give us a couple more minutes for questions. And I had a question for Dana. At the same time, I also want to highlight, before we get to the very end, that we do have another session coming up at 1:45. So there's a short break between the end of this session and the start of the next one. If anybody does need to leave a little early or in the next few minutes to get to their next session, obviously you can feel free to do that. The links are in the Zoom document. My question was actually just to kind of confirm, Dana, that I understood what you were saying. It was so interesting, and it was really beyond my knowledge of what's going on with 5G right now. Did I understand you correctly in saying that basically there are new technologies now that just can't be run on TCP/IP and need these kind of extensive efforts to kind of bleed over into HTTP and whatever, and that there's this need for new protocols that's going to basically mean there will be multiple different protocols, and it's not going to be kind of like an end-to-end system anymore? Is that kind of what you were, the gist of what you were saying?
Yeah, so I'm glad that did come across. Thank you for your question. So yes, there are technologies that are being spurred out at the moment. The main issue is that the terabytes per second data transfers, no matter how much fiber you have in the world, you could even put fiber kind of like a matrix style that it goes into the backs of people's heads. It wouldn't be enough because the processor of the internet protocol is not providing enough latency. We do have options at the moment with the TCP or IP protocol that it gets segmented into two areas, being TCP, which has confirmation codes to ensure that the message is always sent and received in the same process. Whereas, for example, us right now on Zoom, there's a second called user datagram protocol. It was originally made for VoIP telephone calls, and it's important, and its relevance now during COVID cannot be overstated. at the moment, the big issue that industry is looking to accomplish is to have holograms into the market, that people will have individual holograms to be able to meet, have virtual calls in their living room, sitting down with one another. That's the next big push. As well as there is conversations in the food industry to have these, from what I understand, it's a helmet that you would wear and receive sensors, magnetic pulses to make it seem as though you've eaten a certain food. And they're looking at that as well as another area, but holograms are the next kind of big app that they're looking to push, which TCP over IP does not support and would need a new protocol suite.
That's fascinating.
I had a question for Jonathan there, and Jonathan, excuse me because I was popping in and out of your thing, but you set up early on kind of 3 different potential kind of sources of regulatory inspiration, platform governance inspiration, if I remember correctly, and you put a lot of emphasis on Laura DeNardis's view about how platforms themselves have become the real centers of platform regulation. And so I'm wondering, how you feel about the reach towards broadcasting regulation in contemporary policy moves. And my gambit here to say, let's throw it down another rail. I'm not saying, let's just transpose telecoms regulation onto the platforms, but I'm saying, man, there's a lot of really, really valuable resources here, conceptual resources, experience, history that we can draw to bear. So what do you think?
Yeah, thank you for the question. Yeah, I know in my own presentation, I sort of rushed a little bit at the end through the normative regulatory philosophy component. And it's one of these things where I think we have to ask this question, whose philosophy is directing the future of these industries? Is it sort of a corporate philosophy that's very profit-centric, that's driven by the self-regulation that currently exists? Or is it a normative regulatory philosophy that comes from somewhere else, either the top down or the bottom up? And certainly, I was reading an article this morning about C10 in the National Post, and they were saying, let's not, we can all make our own choices about the content that we consume. Let's not put top-down limitations, like broadcasting era type limitations, on online providers. And now this assumes, of course, that the platforms aren't directing us in any way and that we are free to choose the content that we want. But that's, critical cultural scholars have been arguing for many years now, that's not the case. Manipulative design, profit-centric design, advertising models built into these services certainly direct our consumption behaviors in many ways. So yeah, certainly I would welcome top-down approaches, but there is this nuance to doing it right and not limiting speech rights at the same time. So it's a complicated thing to figure out.
For sure. Any other questions that people have for Lian Ray or for David or Dana? I see another one here for me from Derek, but I'll hold off, to just see if we've got some others. Maybe we, instead we don't have much time. I'll quickly give answer to Derek. I started to type one in the chat box, but Derek, my thought is, one, we need to jig our hierarchy of priorities here. We're spending way too much time on the questions of content. It's sucking up all the oxygen, all right? And, yes, there are problems there, but I have 2 points that I want to make about that. One is I think a lot of those problems would be taken care of with the kinds of structural and behavioral regulation that I'm talking about, in terms of, opening up the black box, maybe putting limits on the extent to which information can be hoovered up and mobilized for targeting audiences. And by requiring high levels of information disclosure from the platforms themselves. Okay, so but then I would say also my belief is that we need to have laws like NetzDG, the German approach. All right, we need to formalize rules and law about what kinds of content we want taken down, as opposed to using pressure on companies to, better their social responsibility by cleaning up, the awful but lawful content that's on their services. I think this is a really bad way of going about things. So I think we need to be very clear and set out in legislation what kinds of speech is beyond the pale, and then regulate the companies according to those standards. We can't use backdoors to achieve speech regulation that we can achieve through basically the institutional arrangements